And we are going to record. Okay, one more time. If you guys don't mind muting microphones, that would be great.
You want to put that little bit of Brussels sprouts in a foil pack and just heat it with the rest.
Which has led to in New York City alone. Give me 1 second. I'm trying to handle a little tech business. All right. So, okay, here we go. Thank you, everybody. Sorry, we're getting off to a little bit of a late start, but I'm so glad to see you. I'm Christy. I am the development manager here at the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission. And we are so glad that you're joining us for Armed to the Teeth, the weaponry of early 19th century shipwreck archaeology in the northern Gulf of Mexico. These virtual events were started at the beginning of the pandemic, but they've become part of our regular programming here at the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission. As always, our hope is that through these events, you will continue to get to know us and to learn more about our mission to support the Texas Historical Commission in its preservation efforts across the state. Many of you have chosen to support us with donations through these events, for which we are so grateful. Thank you. I want to welcome our THC commissioners, friends, board members, advisors, as well as some of our colleagues at the Texas Historical Commission who are with us today. Thank you for taking the time to join us. As I mentioned, I'm Christy Peliquin. I'm the development manager for the Friends. Anjali was unable to be with us tonight. Some of you may know her. She's our executive director. We are also joined tonight by our consultant, Katie Kukerbaum, who's the brains behind these events. Couldn't do it without her. And also Hope Barone, who is our social media expert and has been helping us reach out via Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok. If you're on any of these social media platforms, please follow us. We would love to connect with you. Before I get started, I also wanted to let you know about our next virtual event, which is called Deconstructing Tamales, how this ancient food came into its present form. It's scheduled for September 8th at 6 p.m. This event will be presented by Melissa Guerrera, a self-taught culinary expert and food historian, specializing in the foodways of the American continent, especially Texas regional, Mexican, and Latin American cuisine. Registration is already up at thcfriends.org, and we hope that you'll be able to join us for that fascinating and, if I might also say, delicious sounding session. Few housekeeping items before I introduce today's speaker. We would really appreciate it if you could keep your microphones on mute. That really helps everyone be able to hear the speaker well. And it's also nice if you keep your camera on. It's always nice to connect with our fellow participants and see everyone's smiling face. And just an FYI, we will have a Q&A that follows the presentation. If you want to put your questions into the chat, we will move through them. Once the presentation is finished, we will go through all the questions in the chat. And once again, please mute microphones if you can. Thank you so much. We are also recording this event through Facebook Live. So after this, we will send you a link and you can share it with family, friends, or whoever you choose. Okay, let's get down to business. It is my privilege to introduce our presenter for today. As many of you know, the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission's motto is preserving the real places and the real stories of Texas. Storytelling is key to the work of historic preservation. And as the state marine archaeologist, our presenter this evening is not only an expert on this topic, but also has a great many stories to tell. Amy Borgens was appointed state marine archaeologist to the THC in June of 2010. She earned a bachelor's degree in fine arts from Purdue University and received her master's degree from the nautical archaeology program, Department of Anthropology at Texas A&M. She is currently pursuing a doctoral degree focusing on Texas Coastal Shipwreck Archaeology from the Department of Geography at Texas State University. As the state marine archaeologist, Amy is responsible for the preservation, protection, and investigation of shipwrecks and other submerged sites in all state-owned waters. Her specializations include early 19th century Gulf of Mexico maritime history and the study of historic small arms artifact assemblages. Amy's experience in the field of archaeology includes wreck excavation and documentation, conservation, artifact photography, and illustration. Whew, Amy, that's a lot. Thank you so much for being with us this evening, Amy. We can't wait to hear all of things you have to tell us. Take it away.
Recording in progress.
And thank you all for hosting me this evening. This is a subject matter that I pretty much got started upon in graduate school. When I began graduate school in 1997, I actually worked on the LaBelle project as the artifact photographer and radiographer, but one of the shipwrecks I'm going to discuss today was actually my thesis topic. So this sort of got me interested in—
make it home.
Oh, excuse me?
I wanted your room.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. So
I'm so sorry. I'm trying to help with that.
Oh, no, that's fine. That's fine. So yeah, so I'll just, I'm going to synopsize a lot of material and a lot of history really, really quickly today.
Amy, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Okay, I'm muted.
Yeah,
unmuted.
sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so, yes, I'm going to go through a lot of material pretty quickly. And so feel free to follow up with me if you would like more information and, in particular about these specific wrecks. So two of these projects are THC projects or THC partnerships. And then one of these was one that I was involved with before coming to the agency with Texas A&M. So let me just, hold on a second. I'm trying to move stuff around. So the first half of the 19th century in the Gulf of Mexico was characterized.
Would you mind making your slide
Oh, did it not
so that,
go to play?
yeah.
Yeah, sorry. There we go.
The picture is so there. That's
yeah,
so
there,
beautiful.
sorry about
Thank
that.
you, Amy.
I thought I hit that. Okay, yeah. So the first half of the 19th century in the Gulf of Mexico was characterized by almost continuous military conflict and revolution. There were major international and U.S. navies, all of which were present at some point in time during that first 50 years, between 1800 and 1850. And these were often acting in concert with privateers in the region. So we have 3 archaeological sites in Texas in the northern Gulf of Mexico that kind of testifies to this really conflict-driven period in our history, and not just Texas history, but in the northern Gulf and of Mexico in general. And so kind of as a reminder, the sites that I'm going to be discussing, none of these have been fully excavated. We've looked at or recovered less than 10% of these archaeological sites. And so there's a lot still to be learned about the archaeology of these period and of these types of wrecks. But some of what we have available to us right now is a little limited because we haven't fully explored these sites. I'm going to minimize that. So, when you look at the 15th and 16th century, the Gulf of Mexico was predominantly Spanish territory, and this would change over the decades. And a lot of this was through settlement, through treaty, through purchase. And when you start getting into the 1800s, you really do start seeing military conflicts and engagements that sort of create more of these territorial transitions, and especially between the US, Spain, Mexico, and France to a lesser degree. So just a lot of change during those years. Again, especially between about the 18 teens and 1850s. So, and each of these conflicts usually had a maritime component associated with it. So like with the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, but you had the Battle of Lake Borgne with the Mexican War of Independence and the Spanish-American War of Independence. Often these groups were using privateers to act as de facto navies, these revolutionary groups, when they were in revolution against Spain, and then later as Mexico was in revolution against Spain. And then you'll see this again with Texas in their revolution against Mexico. You will see that as well, where there's a dependence on privateering to help create a maritime presence against these larger international powers. And so, in our region, the main privateers that are the most well-known are Lafitte, and he was stationed out of Louisiana originally, and then we had Louis Michel Ari based out of Galveston and Matagorda Bay. And Lafitte would eventually take over Ari's establishment, but Ari really began in Texas. Galveston was sort of created as a Republic of Mexico, and he was using that as a staging area to attack and cripple Spanish shipping, to hurt them economically. So with the Texas Revolution, we had the privateer navy, we had a first and second Texas Navy, and then kind of immediately following that, there was an event called the Pastry War that emerged out of a dispute between a French baker that lived in a small town outside of Mexico City that felt insulted because Mexican officers stole items or goods or looted his store. And so this ended up becoming a conflict between France and Mexico over this pastry chef, where they wanted restitution for essentially any sort of French citizen living in Mexico that had been treated unfairly. And so that resulted in the French blockade of Mexican ports along the Gulf of Mexico. And when you get into 1843, you have the Battle of Campeche, another naval conflict, and this is between the Republic of the Yucatan against Mexico, and they actually paid the Texas Navy to act as an auxiliary navy on their behalf. And this resulted in two sort of major naval conflicts. Each side sort of thought they prevailed, but I think historically these were seen to be more of kind of an even draw. And even with the Mexican-American War in 1846 to 1848, there was a heavy naval presence in the Gulf of Mexico at that time. And I believe that was actually the first amphibious assault by the US Navy in our history. So again, when you're looking at the 18 teens into the late 1840s, there's a lot of direct military conflict occurring within the region, off of our waters and off of our shores. And so by the end of this period, with the annexation of Texas in 1845, which sort of led to the boundary dispute that caused the war with Mexico, and then with our acquisition of most of the remaining Southwest states through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, this really created, at the end of this time period, these conflicts in the Gulf of Mexico sort of resulted in the creation of the landscape, the boundaries of the United States, the continental United States as we know it, just with the exception of this little area here that was purchased from Mexico in 1853. So when there's a tremendous amount of military conflict, like we've seen decade after decade after decade within a certain region, there should be an anticipation that there's going to be trafficking in military arms, towards these conflicts and these battles. And so when you look at, like, one of the earliest accounts I've actually seen of an arms shipment is actually based on the La Salle expedition in 1684. As part of that, they were planning to try to literally take from Spain their silver mines. And as a part of that expedition, they brought 100 troops, 400 French firearms for really a military engagement that never came to fruition. And Spain, when they found out about La Salle's incursion into Spanish territory, also brought arms with them because they were anticipating a fight, which also never occurred. But when you get into the early 1800s, again, this is when you see massive amounts of firearms being brought into this region from really all over the world, and in particularly from English sources or English manufacturers. And it's like in 1808, 1809, 28,000 British muskets were transshipped essentially to Mexico from Jamaica, because there was a fear by Spain that the United States was going to attack their Spanish territory in that region. And I'm just going to give you kind of a cross-sectional view just to really illustrate how many firearms were being brought out with regularity. And when I was working on my thesis, I had this really simple question that I started with. My thesis shipwreck, which is, we call it the Pascagoula wreck, that's wrecked right off of the entrance to Matagorda Bay, and it had predominantly British firearms. And so, one of my key questions was, well, why would you have a shipwreck right at the mouth of Matagorda Bay with British arms? And that was really kind of opened an amazing Pandora's box. And I literally at that point in time just started studying arms procurement, watching shipments. Especially there were groups out of New Orleans, for example, that were constantly financing some of these revolutions and procuring these arms. And so that kind of became a mini obsession. So this is just a teaser of some of this research, I guess all kinds of transfer of weapons. When you get into the later Spanish period with some of their presidios in Texas, they're constantly asking for arms. They were always undersupplied. And so you see quite a bit of movement during that period. But when you get into the Mexican independence, Mexico was also afraid of a Spanish reprisal. And so one of the first things they did was they started creating contracts with British banks to buy ships and to buy arms, because they were wanting to defend their boundaries by sea. And so they were trying to create a navy, and then again, like buy infantry weapons as a part of that. And so there's huge loans from British banks for ships and firearms. But I mean, just look at these numbers. You're seeing these in the tens of thousands. And just like when you get into the 18 teens, 1815, 16, like General Gates, Pirate William Mitchell, you're going to start seeing a lot of involvement from privateers as a conduit to bringing these supplies into the region. And so again, the privateer vessels could be used to attack merchant ships, Spanish merchant ships, to try to cripple them economically, but they were also transferring these goods as well. And you're going to see English firearms come up a lot in these. Sorry, I need to move my little title bar so I can see. But again, this weaponry and this need for weaponry really went unabated. So you see this again during the Texas Revolution. Sorry. And again, cargoes large and small. Like some of these were maybe carrying one box or 2 boxes, 22 boxes. Some of the examples I found have stated that some of these boxes could hold 20 to 25 weapons. And when you're looking at some of the sources of these arms, they're coming from all over the United States as well. And during the Mexican-American War, there were 2 areas where a lot of the weaponry were that the U.S. Navy and the U.S. military was using. We had a military depot at Indianola and also at the Port of Brazos, Santiago. So those were areas that these weapons were being shipped to and then redistributed. So, again, when you look at archaeology, like, what kind of archaeology do we have that represents all of this movement, all of this shipment, all of this arms procurement? And do we have any naval vessels? Do we have anything that represents all the naval activity and all the arms trade that went with the conflict of this time? And so we do have armament on the 1554 Spanish plate fleet that's not really associated with these engagements, but I just wanted to give it a nod. I mentioned La Belle with the 400 arms that were brought here in the 17th century. And then we have 3 other shipwrecks, and that all, right now the evidence sort of suggests they all date to perhaps the 18 teens, 1820s. The Pascagoula wreck, this again is also known as my thesis wreck, which is just off the entry to Matagorda Bay. Mardi Gras shipwreck, which is about 4,000 feet deep off of Louisiana coast, and then Monterey Shipwreck A, which is a cluster of 3 vessels far off in the Gulf of Mexico, kind of off of the Texas and Louisiana coast. So I'm just going to kind of go through these chronologically in the order that they were discovered, because when I first started on my thesis and I was looking at the arms that I'm going to introduce you to, I didn't really have anything else to compare the collection with from a maritime standpoint. Honestly, some of the best parallels for some of the weaponry from these shipwrecks comes from Texas Revolution sites here in Texas. So the Pascagoula wreck was discovered by the National Underwater Marine Agency in 1998. And this was a survey that was conducted to actually look for LaMob, the second of one of LaSalle's ships to have wrecked on the Texas coast. And they did not find LaMob. This was mistakenly believed to be LaMob because flintlock weapons were on it, and flintlock technology was around for hundreds of years and dated to the time of LaBelle. So it was mistakenly believed that, and LaBelle and LaMob, that it was mistakenly believed that this might represent that shipwreck. So the site itself is rather small. The diving conditions are zero visibility in this area. I've dived a couple times, I think. I've dived here twice on that wreck site. When I dived both times, it was buried, but again, it was sort of the consistency of chocolate milk. I was so, because you're only 20, 25 feet deep, the water is illuminated, but you still can't really see anything anyway. So it's kind of like chocolate milk. So there were 65 concretions that were recovered for analysis, and a concretion is like a kind of a concrete-like matrix that starts to surround cultural material, especially iron, as it breaks down. And once you remove that matrix and you remove the concretion, it can reveal other artifacts as well. So there were about 65 concretions, and that produced just over 200 artifacts. And there's a wood-boring mollusk that consumes wood, Trado novalis, and so any wood hull remnants that are exposed in the water column get consumed. And so none of the ship itself remains for the Pascagoula wreck, but we do have quite a bit of material culture. So this is just a kind of a quick site map that was made by the THC archaeologists and their volunteers that participated in the diving in 1998. And since I'm discussing the firearms, I'm just going to talk about those objects, but I will say that that was a majority of what was recovered. So there were 9 musket fragments. The musket stocks are made of wood, so that same wood-boring mollusk consumes gun wood as well, any kind of wood on a site that's exposed. But there were also a bunch of sort of loose, isolated, what we call furniture, like trigger guards and butt plates as well, because if the wood gets consumed, these items are just going to be scattered and there's kind of lying around the site. There were 3 cannonballs that were recovered, 4 canister shot, and 86 musket balls. And kind of what you see here is I don't know if you can see my little pointer, but they created datum points and then collected artifacts within a radius of each datum point. And so they didn't, again, the site wasn't fully excavated. It was just a sample of artifacts were collected because at the time they were hoping to confirm that this was the wreck of LaMob. And actually, but by bringing up the variety of artifacts that were recovered, it was demonstrated pretty quickly that that wasn't that 17th century French ship. Yeah, so of the firearm material, 83% of that was British. So this was the most complete, and a little bit later I go on a little bit in more detail about the difference between the patterns, but this was the most complete of the firearms that was recovered, the one on the top. So we had 2 examples of this sort of shortland patterned musket. Like the bottom 2, it's a lock mechanism as a side plate, and those 2 were actually bolted together, these 2 items here, the color images, but the rest of the wood stock was gone. It was just the 2 pieces. And a majority of the firearm pieces were, the firearm muskets and their hardware, the loose hardware, were of the India pattern, the British military infantry musket at that time. And these were, and you're going to kind of see the India pattern musket get mentioned quite a bit throughout this talk, because these were manufactured in mass because there was a huge demand for additional arms for the Napoleonic Wars. And so almost 3.5 million India arms were produced. And then when the wars came to a close, and there was also a new pattern adopted, literally called the New Land pattern, the British government was just looking to get rid of these arms. And so these arms were inexpensive because they had been produced so quickly. They were thought of as being sort of inferior quality. So these were able to be sold in mass quantities rather inexpensively, and to groups like the kind of fledgling new independent countries like Texas and Mexico. These were kind of bargains. Like, I hate to say bargain basement firearms, but there were a lot of them, and they were really inexpensive, and they could be acquired in extremely large quantities. So again, this is just an example of, again, a lot of the individual loose pieces representing both patterns, like several different British patterns. Again, you're sort of seeing pieces of the firearms too, just the little wooden fragments, a trigger plate, some of the loose ramrod pipes. And some of these arms and trigger guards had sort of these rack numbers, these inventory numbers, which you can plainly see in these images. And this one trigger guard here looks similar to a French design. And you can, if you look at it, it's supposed to have a lug attachment. I don't know if you can see that in the lower of the two images of it, but they've put a screw hole through it as well. And so some of these definitely show evidence of reuse and repair. So when you look at the regimental marks, there were three main regimental marks that were found on the weapons for the Pascavallo rack. So you had the 52nd Regiment of Foot, the Oxfordshire Regiment, one second, keep having to move my minion bar, which was served in Spain during the Peninsular Wars. This middle one here, I don't know if you can see it's like Grenadier Bombay Infantry. So this was an Indian regiment. And then the one that I find the most exciting is this image that's going to be on your far right, the 41st Regiment of Foot. And so the 41st Regiment of Foot, it actually started its life as an invalid unit in 1719. And so this is where soldiers, this is a troop that soldiers that were maybe injured and unable to actively fight could be serving in this particular regiment. But by 1793, it was converted to a marching unit, so now kind of more of an active infantry unit. And in 1793, it was actually deployed to the Caribbean. And during the War of 1812, you can see that it's in Montreal and Detroit. And here we are here. And so I'm like, my presumption is that a lot of these arms that we're seeing with these regimental marks from the 41st Regiment may be coming from sources in the Caribbean, which also served as kind of a tremendous black market for reused arms, especially for privateers. In addition to the British firearms, we had two musket examples and then some isolated loose pieces from the 1757 Spanish military musket. Let me see, yeah, and these were the 1752 and was the first of the Spanish military infantry muskets to actually employ a French-style lock mechanism as opposed to the Miquelette lock, which had preceded it. And then there was one example of a Ketlin and Company English trade pistol. And one of the neat things about this collection is we had these two concretions here, and and on that lower image, the upper image, we've actually removed some of the overlying concretion, but the lower image shows what it looks like once it's recovered. And it actually, as the concretion forms, it picks up elements of the environment. And so it's sand, it's shells, it's rocks. So it really kind of camouflages into the seafloor, and you have to remove that with a pneumatic chisel. So these two images you see are sort of reconstructions of what that collection, each of those collection of three muskets would have looked like. And also, in addition to the way they're stacked in these, there was packing dunnage, like an organic material such as a straw. And so there's pretty strong evidence from a lot of these weapons that these were packed in boxes, potentially as cargo. And in addition to the firearms, we had saber fragments. These were kind of mass-produced German triple fuller blades that could be really put on any kind of hilt. Different countries could order these and just attach them to their own locally manufactured weapons. And we also had British socket bayonets. And then we had a 6 and 12 pounder cannonballs. We had canister shot, musket balls. And then this right here, this thing at the top of your page or your screen it's anti-rigging. It's a bar shot, and this is a Spanish style of bar shot as well. And, I mentioned earlier that we did not have a ship, but even in absence of a ship, you can have its cultural material still be present. And so this shipwreck was copper sheaths, which is what you see on the upper left. This was to protect that wooden hull from the Trado Navalis. That mollusk didn't just attack a ship after it wrecked, it also attacked it and consumed it during its active life. And then you had the fasteners that held the frames to the planks of the frames, and then rigging elements. And then this kind of really neat item on the lower right is called pig iron ballast. And this was rectangular iron ballast that could be really easily stacked along the center line of a vessel. And that kind of actually began its life as military technology. It was really effective if you had a ship that had broadside guns for sort of counterbalancing them by really being able to control more closely the weight, your ballast weight along the keelson. The second shipwreck I'm going to introduce you today is the Mardi Gras Shipwreck Project. And I actually got invited on this project because it had a box of muskets that you could see in the video. And so this was a partnership between, well, actually it was an A&M project, but it was really commenced or initiated by the former MMS, but the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement. BOEM and Bessie have archaeologists that make sure that shipwreck archaeology is protected in advance of oil exploration. So these next two shipwrecks I'm going to discuss sort of came out of that offshore oil exploration activity. So the Mardi Gras shipwreck was discovered initially in 2001 during a remote sensing survey ahead of a pipeline project. And in 2002, it was confirmed to be a shipwreck archaeological site. Now, after Hurricane Ivan in 2004, BOEM asked the oil contractors to check their pipelines for damage, and it ended up that the Okeanos is it's part of BP Oil, and one of their subcontractors that was inspecting the lines went off the line, found the shipwreck, and started removing artifacts from it, which was unlawful. And so once BOEM found out about this, A&M was essentially hired to come in and try to mitigate the damage that was done to the site. And so the field investigations for A&M started in 2007, and the mission was essentially to try to remove surface evidence of the wreck. So we were supposed to, A&M, like when I was at A&M at that time, we were trying to recover any of the material culture that was above the sediment to make the site unrecognizable. So this site's predominantly buried. It's about 65 by 15 feet. And again, we don't really know, because it's buried, we don't know how much of the shipwreck that represents. And more than 2,800 artifacts were recovered for analysis. So this is a site plan of the archaeological site, what was visible above the sediment line. And then I just have a little inset here, sort of highlighting where the arms material culture is. You have a cannon with some bird shot, that Amy's favorite box of muskets right there, and then lead shot and other ferrous shot and gun flints sort of around the site. So this is a photo mosaic of the site showing the cannon. And unfortunately, it broke after recovery. And, and these things were brought up a distance of 4,000 feet through the water column by, some of the investigation was done through ROV, but some of these larger objects were actually strapped and then brought up through the water column, like this cannon was. So this cannon was manufactured in 1797 by the Clyde Company. It's a 6-pounder. And it was overturned on the seafloor. And so what you have here attached to it was actually part of the gun carriage. It was upside down. So most of the wood gun carriage was consumed. And this is a reconstruction drawing that I did to just sort of better illustrate what that would have looked like at a time, prior to the shipwreck, right? And its degradation underwater. And One thing we do know from the diagnostic measurements is it's a 6-pounder, what's kind of called a merchant market cannon. So it's smaller than government regulation military guns. And so this was something that was more informal, again, like something that would have been good for privateering. It had been hoped that this box of muskets would be recovered, but it was actually really concreted into the shipwreck itself, and the different attempts to remove that artifact just failed. And so even though the project intent was to try to remove the material culture so it wouldn't be as recognizable as a shipwreck and vulnerable to looting, that was left on the seafloor. And the only weapons artifact that was actually recovered from that musket box, and I have it highlighted here in the lower left, at the bottom was a butt plate that actually had sort of dropped off of the musket case onto the ground. And so that was collected and determined to be a kind of a Germanic Dutch butt plate manufactured in Potsdam, and of a type of mercenary arm that was heavily used during the American Revolution. But, you know, so I had to do analysis from video, which is challenging, but there's still some things that you can deduce. Like, for example, this butt plate here, if you look at it, where you have the German butt plate that was screw fastened, this one is a lug attachment, much like this British butt plate here. And so even though we couldn't recover the musket box itself, we do know that it was carrying a mixed assemblage of probably multinational firearms. And then you can see here that there were two, you can actually see one full sword, but there were actually swords that were packed on top of this box as well. And again, it's really hard to do analysis for video, but some of the best examples for sword types were American and British hanger swords. In the very end of the box, there was a collection of at least 7 pistols that were stowed in there. And then we also had gun flints, musket balls and birdshot. And this big object here, there was a huge concretion on the seafloor, and that concretion was removed in mass. And when that was brought to the conservation lab and the archaeologists started removing it, like removing that concretion, it was actually recognized that in the act of removing concretion, we actually captured a little bit of the fragment of the shipwreck itself within that concretion. And so what you're looking at here, and I have an arrow pointing to a cannonball, there's several cannonballs, but as this artifact was mechanically cleaned, and this is kind of a drawing to visualize what that ended up being, but you have the outer hull planks, you have the frames, you have the inner deck, why did I just forget the name of it? Sorry, I'm having a moment, but the interior planking in the cargo area. And then I've kind of highlighted here, you can see examples of cannonball and bar shot. There's a box of tools at the top, but the area I've colorized was a huge cast of iron. And when we started looking at what that was, I'm highlighting here on the right, we have bar shot, we have langrage, which is a canvas bag essentially full of shrapnel. That's anti-personnel shot. That was actually really heavily used during the War of 1812 in the United States. But the container itself was filled with kind of scrap raw iron. And so, you know, in this huge concretion, we had 74 4 to 6 pounder shot. We had 2,600 musket balls, and there were also 61 gun flints. And some of the musket balls and gun flints were collected from other areas around the site. But this broken up iron, that is also any personnel shot. You would just take that and you would shove it down the barrel of a gun and shoot it. And this was a really convenient way if you were involved in broadside fighting, and this was considered dirty fighting. I'm putting that in quotes, air quotes, but that was an easy way to kind of clear a deck. This was any personnel rounds. And again, there were more artifacts that were recovered. I'm just really focusing on the armament today and the military arms, but there was British creamware, British beer bottles, a British musket bottle, spy glasses. This is like American earthenware, a French style wine bottle. There was one Mexican minted coin from 1808. And And the spoons are a French manufacturer. So again, what I kind of like about these shipwrecks, and we see these on a lot of these, is the material culture is very multinational in appearance, which you would really expect at that time. A lot of the bottles and ceramics were being heavily imported from Britain at that time, and there was just a lot of international trade, and especially within the Gulf with Veracruz. And so again, like the more and more we're looking at these kinds of wreck collections, you're seeing this real diversity in the nationality of the types of goods that are represented. The third wreck is the Monterey Shipwreck Project. Shipwreck A is the one we're going to be talking about today. And this was a federal and state partnership to evaluate this deep water archaeological site at about 4,300 feet. The archaeological data recovery, the testing on this is actually I think it's still the deepest project of its type in the United States. So this was discovered as one of 3 unknown acoustic targets in 2011 for a Shell oil company project. And NOAA later went out, they worked with BOEM in selecting targets to look at as part of one of their deep water expeditions. And they went out in 2012, and they looked at this site. And there was so much interest in the site at that time from that original video footage that a team was created to go back out. And this was in 2013, and the THC was part of that partnership to collect other artifacts for analysis to try to ID this shipwreck. And in 2013, as part of that offshore ROV expedition, which you can see in that image, 2 other shipwrecks were confirmed as well. And then in 2014, there was yet another NOAA OER expedition, a video expedition to the sites. So this particular hull is preserved to the waterline. It was copper sheathed. It's about 84 by 26 feet long, again at the waterline length, and more than 60 artifacts were recovered for analysis. So again, there's 3 of these shipwrecks. We're looking at just this one today, Monterey Shipwreck A. This is a beautiful photo mosaic. The definition of the ship is actually being delineated by the copper sheathing line. And I've highlighted here a long gun, and then 4 smaller guns, 4 carronades. And then there's a kind of a third longer object in the middle that we were, 6 larger object in the middle that we were never able to really confirm from video evidence if it was a cannon or not. There were also muskets, 2 collections of muskets amidship and at the stern. And I'm just going to kind of walk you through the cannon really quickly. This one, because of the certain attribute, is believed to be potentially a pivot gun. And pivot guns kind of began, like, even though we do have limited use of pivot cannon, pivot long guns during the War of 1812 on the Great Lakes, this was a predominantly privateer weapon, and we see it also being used in the Texas and Mexican navies, those early navies in the 20s and 30s. If you look underneath that, there's 2 carronades. So that's what you're seeing on the left. You've got the 2 carronades that are underneath that cannon, and then there's 2 more at the stern. And just based on their concreted forms, you could have 2 different types. One with trunnions, one without, the joint carronade. These look like they're joint carronades, and this was these were a military innovation of like the last quarter of the 18th century. So like 1780s is when these were being developed and became popular. And one of the things that I was really curious about is, so if you're looking at these 2 gun boxes, those may or may not be cargo. And the purple highlighted object is this one thing that may or may not be a cannon. But what I'm illustrating for you is if these other carronades were armament, this is what you would expect the configuration to be: broadside guns and the pivot, centrally mounted pivot guns. Now, if these guns were cannon, you would have the red pivot gun, which would be the armament for the ship. But if these carronades were cargo, you would expect to find them paired up on opposite sides of the keel to counterbalance themselves. And so if you look at the configuration of how these cannon were found on the ship, I really think, everything was sort of listing to starboard because of the way the ship was resting on the seafloor. I think the configuration of the cannon really resembles cargo, as opposed to the carronades anyway, or cargo. So as opposed to this being a ship with an armament of 5 artillery, I think we're looking at a ship with one single pivot gun, and then the rest of these are possibly, and including the muskets, are probably cargo. So this right here is the midship box of muskets. Those are the trigger guards. That's actually the butts of the guns. They just degraded and fell away from the main collection. And these are, I highlighted here, we just picked up a sample of those firearms, because you can have manufacturing dates and maker's marks on them. So we recovered those. There was also a hinge for the box itself that was recovered. So again, you're going to be looking with this collection again at the shortland pattern, the India pattern, and we believe we have a piece of furniture from a sea service musket, all English, British pattern arms. And this is sort of just showing again the preserved length, because again the wood was degraded and consumed by mollusks. So this is a British shortland pattern musket. 2 examples in those images, and I like to show X-ray images. The CRL has some really nice images, and this is an image from the Pascavallo wreck just for comparison. So sometimes even when these things are concreted, you can still gain evidence from X-rays and see their attributes. That wrist plate that is pointed out there, that's what's on the far right. You can see that it has inventory number, company rack number. And again, like this is another shortland pattern with musket, again, another inventory number on it. So again, like a lot of these arms we're seeing from the guns that we were able to recover from at least 2 of these shipwrecks, they've got markings that indicate use, that these are reused guns. Just again, kind of more X-rays. You can see the trigger, you can see the through bolt patterns. Same with this one. So this was a small, but it was still just an aspect of a musket. So this is a shortland pattern musket, musket butt plate. And one of the things I'm kind of pointing out here is that sometimes when they're still concreted, it's tempting to try to see if you can figure out what the marks are. But once this was mechanically cleaned, it was again the 41st Regiment of Foot. So that same really unique former invalid unit that was stationed in the Caribbean in 1793, 1794, those same regimental marks were on weapons in this particular shipwreck as well. Now with the India pattern, they reduced the number of ramrod pipes, and they just started simplifying this furniture. They removed the wrist plate, and they sort of streamlined the firearm furniture. They shortened the side plate. And again, there's an example of the butt plate with that 41st Regiment of Foot marking on it. And if you've noticed, they have 2 different patterns of guns that both have that 41st Regiment of Foot. And when that regiment was being deployed in 1793, that was actually when the firearms were being transitioned from the shortland pattern to the India pattern. So it wouldn't surprise me if one detachment was sent with the shortland pattern arms and then a later detachment was sent with the India pattern arms. Now with the British Sea Service musket, again, you're kind of seeing a simplification in design. For that, we only have one object. And again, it's really hard to ID like a complete musket from just one piece of furniture. But again, the best parallel was the British Sea Service musket. And this had, again, potentially like a regimental mark or name. We were not able to clean it in a way that was legible. Now, again, like more evidence from video, if you see what I'm pointing out here, that is a musket stock with a barrel band. And so that's significant as well, because all the British muskets and American muskets that predate the American Revolution had ramrod pipes, but French military muskets, French infantry muskets, and the American muskets and the Spanish muskets that copied them all had barrel bands. And so even though we collected and recovered British arms kind of by happenstance. It just ended up being what we collected. There's evidence that there are other musket types on the seafloor as well. So again, we had, as a goal, we tried to collect kind of an example of the major types of artifacts that were on the seafloors. We had Dutch gin bottle, Irish three-ring decanter, shell edgeware, polychrome teacup, more creamware. Navigational tools are really great because they often have dates, and there's a spoon with someone's personal initials on it. Really, really neat collection of artifacts. And what we do know from this artifact assemblage is kind of like with the Mardi Gras shipwreck. A lot of the artifacts dated the last quarter of the 18th century to the early 1820s. But with this particular site, we know that it has to date to 1816 or later. So kind of in summary, I feel like I'm just running you through these shipwrecks. I just want you to know I can talk about any of these shipwrecks ad nauseum, probably for hours. So I'm just kind of giving you the most abridged version of this that I can. But so with each of these wrecks, you're seeing a mixture of military types, you know, and again, with Pascavallo, that was most of what was collected. We didn't have any ceramics or glass objects collected with that wreck, but it's also only 25 feet deep. So that was probably salvaged at the time of its loss. But again, with Mardi Gras and Monterey, you're seeing a mixture of British and French, you know, Irish, Dutch. You're seeing kind of a real mixture, kind of an international assortment of artifacts that really sort of alludes to the trade at that time. So you're probably asking yourself, do we have an idea of what we think these are? So the Pascavallo wreck, just through doing research, and it's a little bit easier to research shipwreck sites that are close to shore because there's just a lot more information than that. And I narrowed it down to 3. The privateer Ari lost 2 shipwrecks coming in and out of Pascavallo in 1817. There was a Mexican naval vessel, General Bustamante, that wrecked, bringing a detachment up, I want to say to Port Lavaca, that wrecked somewhere in that general area. And then there was a Texas Revolution era gunrunner, Hannah Elizabeth, that sank in the pass while being chased by the Mexican Navy in 1835. And that was carrying 2 boxes of mixed arms. And for the longest time, I was favoring Hannah Elizabeth as a candidate until we found the Monterey A shipwreck. And I really started seeing better parallels for the material culture right down to the regimental mark for those weapons. And I have the Drain the Oceans icon there because Drain the Oceans is going to have a show that's going to be focusing on the archaeology of the Texas Revolution period. And as part of that, they'll be highlighting the Pascavallo wreck because if it is the Ari shipwreck, then it's definitely tied to activities of the Mexican Revolution. The Mardi Gras shipwreck, there's a War of 1812 privateer that sank off of Louisiana that had a 6-pounder, but because it's so far offshore, we really don't have enough evidence to say conclusively that that's what it is. I mean, there were over 200 privateers in circulation off of Louisiana at this point in time, and so without more evidence, it's kind of hard to say if what we're looking at. Is it a War of 1812 privateer? Because of some of the anti-personnel shot and the anti-rigging shot, in the language, it does look like it's a privateer, but we're just not quite sure from what period. Is it War of 1812? Is it Mexican Revolution? And then Monterey Shipwreck A, sort of a similar problem again with all of these. Less than 10% of the material culture was collected, and you know, we were wondering if it was a privateer, if those other 2 vessels were its prizes, and if they all were lost at sea at the same time in a storm. Was it a convoy? Like we had a military vessel, perhaps a mercenary vessel escorting cargo ships just because of all the conflict at that time that would have been useful. But also, you know, was it military use? You know, because again, with that pivot gun, yes, that was a favored cannon of privateers, but it also was for the Mexican Navy, the Texas Navy, and the Yucatan Navy as well. So, yeah, and just, you know, I always kind of try to remind myself of things that are important to discuss, but unlike more traditional navies, the early navies in the Gulf of Mexico often followed the vessel types of the privateers. And we actually find that Even the Texas and Mexican navies were actually building some of their ships out of Baltimore. So there's a lot of cross-pollination at this point in time in the teens and 20s and 30s with these early Navy ships, these early prototype Navy ships for these early republics and privateering in their vessels. And because of that, and because naval insignia, like on plates and, like where you might expect to find them, may not have been on some of these Navy ships this early. Like certainly the U.S. Navy didn't have emblems on some of their plates this early. Some of these shipwrecks may be difficult to distinguish from one another. So if you find one of these wrecks, is it a Navy ship or is it a privateer? And again, right now we're up to 3 archaeological sites. That's not really enough to establish a baseline for to better help us understand this archaeology, to recognize it when we see it in the future. So, all I can do, and folks like me that really love this period and love this archaeology, we just have to kind of wait for more discoveries and see if we can learn more that helps us understand these wrecks. And just as a reminder too, we should never be lost upon us as archaeologists or as an audience that a lot of these shipwrecks, especially these ones that are so far offshore, they're not just archaeological sites, they're memorial sites. These crews could be anywhere from 5 or 6 to dozens to 60 to 70 if it's a privateer or military vessel. So often this far offshore in particular, there was a loss of life that occurred at the time of the wrecking event. So these are also memorial sites as well. And just as kind of a reminder and as a PSA, in Texas, archaeological sites on state public land, including shipwrecks, they're protected by state law. We do not allow salvage of our shipwrecks in state waters. And there's also federal laws that protect these sites as well. With the from state to state, the laws vary. But and again, if it's any kind of oil exploration, there's other regulatory agencies and other authorities that guide and protect those wrecks as well. So yeah, that's the end of my talk. I have a whole bunch of partners to thank. These were amazing projects to work on. When I started, I can stop sharing. Hold on a second. When I started working on these sites with my thesis wreck, and I actually got to know a lot of archaeologists that specialize in Texas Revolution era archaeology, because with these firearms, these British firearms in particular, you're looking at, with those 2 patterns, you're looking at a 40 or 50 year manufacturing period, but then you're also seeing these same arms being used sometimes 30 and 40 years after their terminal construction date. This area was so economically depressed, and there was so much demand for firearms and cannons that the people didn't mind reusing these weapons. And even during the Mexican-American War, they would take these older arms and they would convert them to percussion locks. So my simple question when I started my thesis and I was investigating those, why would British arms be at the entrance to Matagorda Bay? Little did I know that you find British arms everywhere. It's almost a 1-to-1. Like I would be surprised to find archaeological sites that are related in the Gulf, related to the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Texas Revolution, any of these conflicts that don't have some kind of British military firearm associated with it. So I will stop myself and let us move on to Q&A. Yeah.
Amy, this was incredible, and we are so grateful that you volunteered your time after work to be with us and share all of this information. So thank you.
Yeah.
And we do have questions.
Yeah.
So I'm going to back up in the chat so we can get to the first question. There's lots of comments about how great your photos were in your presentation, so that's wonderful. The first question that I see is from Renee, and it asks, are the ballast stones commonly made from a certain type of stone? Curious if they also degrade underwater like steel or wood.
Ballast stones do not degrade, they're rocks. They can become covered with marine life. And, I was telling you that as iron artifacts degrade, they form kind of a concretion or incrustation around them. That will cover anything in that general vicinity. So it was like when I was working with my thesis collection of artifacts, it was really common for me to find ballast stones actually concreted to some of the guns. And so the rocks won't degrade. And there were different ways that those could be acquired. Like sometimes those were river rocks, they could be kind of really polished. There was kind of a whole industry for ballasting ships. Again, those big iron blocks, and I want to say, I think the one we have is close to 200 pounds. Like that, again, that was something that started out as kind of a military technology because it was really good for kind of, as I said, offsetting and counterbalancing broadside guns. But that was something that also you start seeing trickle down into regular use. Like I think even by the 1820s, I was seeing them on yachts, and it's like same thing with copper sheathing. Copper sheathing began as a military technology because they protect the wooden hulls from being consumed by that mollusk. Well, the Navy was really interested in prolonging the life of their military ships, so they were the ones that were developing that. And France and England were actually competing to see who would get it developed first. And so that's another type of material that, and again, the same thing with those kind of mixed metal, kind of bronze fasteners. You can't have copper sheathing with iron fasteners underneath it, so you had to have a different fastener type. And all of that stuff, again, it was kind of developed for the use in the navies, and then over time, it diffused into generalized use and became less expensive.
Thank you. And thank you for that question, Renee. It's great. This one's not so much a question, but a comment from James. He says, I'm very interested in the similarity of the Indian pattern flintlock pistol trigger guard and a very similar trigger guard I recovered near Sabinal, Texas. Would love to follow up with you at a further date.
Yeah, please. I'm pretty easy to find online. I'm the state marine archaeologist. So if you Google that in Texas, you will get my contact information. And I literally get emailed and texted pictures of firearm furniture pretty frequently. I can't say that I'm not, I know of very specific types of weapons, especially those were used regionally, but I've got a little network of individuals that I reach out to if it's something that's outside of my expertise. And yeah, again, like I really started to get to know individuals. I'll give a shout out to Greg Dimmick, individuals that were working with the material culture from a lot of the Texas Revolution sites, because this was, even if the shipwreck ends up dating to 1817, it's really the only Texas shipwreck that has artifact parallels to Texas Revolutionary battlefield sites because we were using the same guns for so long. And, a complexity I didn't even get into is the reason they're called India pattern arms is because England needed so many guns so fast. For their troops in India, there was a very specific weapon being produced for them. And the Board of Ordnance bought those weapons, and then they started producing copies of them. And that's why it's the India pattern. So when you're looking at India pattern firearms, there's actually two different types you can look for. You can look for the ones that are made by the Board of Ordnance or the ones that were made by the East India Company, and they have different marks, but again, there's a lot of complexity to studying firearms. And I do not pretend to be an expert. And I know a nugget of what's out there.
Much more than I do and many people. So we're considering you the expert for the moment. Another question from Dahlem is, do you know where the Independence, renamed Independencia, and Liberty ships from the first Texas Navy ended up?
Okay, I would have to look that up. We actually have a database of shipwrecks. And what I can tell you is for the Texas Revolution period, for the privateer Navy and the first and second Navies, the only archaeology we have that represents that is a vessel believed to be Zavala that's on Port of Galveston property. As ports were built out, they would sometimes fill in the shoreline. And so, or like at this point, it's in the bay. Like when you're, New York's really well known for doing this. And so Galveston, part of the Port of Galveston was filled in and built on top of, and there's actually a shipwreck underneath a parking lot, essentially. And so, yeah, so I think that's, as far as I know, I think that's the only confirmed archaeology that represents any of the shipwrecks of the Texas Navy. There is a shipwreck on the beach at Boca Chica that a lot of folks locally think is the Mexican Navy ship Moctezuma, but it's not. I wrote a really long article trying to debunk that identification that you can find online. Like if you guys, there's quite a bit of this that is that are public articles that don't contain sensitive information that I can share. So if you have interest in Texas underwater archaeology, just please let me know. But just so you know, I'm like super busy. I'm also about to go on vacation, and so if I don't respond back immediately to your emails, just ping me again and write me back, and I'll don't let me lose track of you. But I can be hard to reach sometimes.
Thank you, Amy. We have, again, so many compliments about your presentation and saying it's fascinating and that it's amazing. A question from Alan is, are they the same Monterey or just the same name but different shipwrecks?
If you're talking about the, okay, so the Monterey Shipwreck Project, and there's 3 shipwrecks with the Monterey Project, and there's 1 with the Mardi Gras Project. Those are actually named after the oil exploration project. So like what was actually interesting about these deep water wrecks that are 4,000 feet deep is on Mardi Gras, that it actually had one of those little red party cups, like trash filters down to the seafloor. And I think people thought that that's what the wreck was named after, right? Because there was a party cup and it was Mardi Gras, but that was actually the oil exploration project's name. And so with the same thing with the Monterey shipwrecks, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, the Monterey shipwrecks, there's 3. One of them is quite large. And that's a really neat talk on its own. The Monterey shipwrecks, there's the one that has the guns, and there's one that was carrying a cargo of what looks like hide, and then the other one didn't have a cargo at all. But so we don't really know what the purpose of that third vessel, which was really large. It was over 100 feet, preserved length, or about 100 feet. But that's, again, there's some articles I can distribute on those as well. That, like, each of these shipwrecks that I just walked and waltzed through, each is their own talk. It's really hard. With the Monterey wrecks, I usually get asked which of those is my favorite of those 3. And the part of me that my father was a gun collector, and there's a part of me that kind of growing up in that environment wants to lean towards Monterey A. But again, like the cargo hides, they're in rolls. That, to me, that's fascinating, because we know that the cattle trade was an industry here in Texas and in the Gulf, and it's one thing to read about it. It's another thing to actually see the archaeological evidence of it. And that third Monterey shipwreck is really damaged. So whatever it was that sank those 3 ships, that third wreck, Monterey C, is the one that bears the most physical evidence of it. It's actually like a lot of the ballast and the objects were all at the stern, like almost like it hit the bottom stern first and everything kind of collected down there. So that one's kind of hyper dramatic as far as shipwrecks go.
Wow. Okay, thank you for that. Beverly is asking, are the mollusks found on wooden shipwrecks in all oceans or just warmer waters of the Gulf?
It's warmer waters in general. And I'll tell you something that was really interesting, and I hope I'm not paraphrasing this incorrectly, but when we first started working on some of these deep water wrecks, it was thought that they were so deep and the water was so cold that they wouldn't be subject to consumption, but they are. And even I was in the Falkland Islands. These Teredo mollusks don't usually live in cold water, but when I was on a project a few years ago in the Falklands, they were showing us evidence of that kind of organism damage down there as well. But kind of in a nutshell, more often than not, you find those mollusks in warmer salt water throughout the world, but not in freshwater. And so that's why in freshwater, you get that amazing, like it's in the Great Lakes where you can have shipwrecks with the mast still standing. Like that's possible because they don't have that kind of organic consumption occurring.
Makes sense. Okay, Maggie would like to know, I would like to know which artifact materials are least likely to survive the time underwater and or the eventual trip to the surface. Are wood and other fragile items left in situ?
Okay, that's a big question. So here's something that was very interesting. Usually, like in my experience when I used to work in conservation, in saltwater, iron is the worst. And I can't remember if it rusts or degrades, like I don't know if it's 6 times faster than it is on land, but so iron breaks down underwater. Wood gets consumed. And so in my experience, Wood and iron are the worst. Brass, bronze, lead, silver, there, a lot of the metals hold up pretty well. And again, but my experience has largely been sort of shallow water wrecks or shallower water wrecks, like, upwards of, 200 feet and shallower. When we started looking at these deep water wrecks, what we found really interesting was that the cupreous stuff, the brass stuff, especially on Monterey A, was horrible. So usually these kind of brass bronze objects in shallow water have really fantastic preservation. So I don't know if you noticed that when you were looking at the Pasta Caballo wreck, some of those hardware items, that furniture, the gun furniture, you could polish that up and make it look new if you wanted to. But if you looked at that same material from the Monterey shipwrecks, it was all broken. It degraded. And that was something that me and the other conservators, when we were looking at those objects coming up from those water depths, were really surprised by. But as an added note, those teredos cannot live in that teredo Navalic. They have to have oxygen to persevere. And so anything buried below the sediment line in the mud and the dirt, the sand, that perseveres, that preserves fairly well. And that includes organic material. So you can have a rope and leather. You can have really amazing preservation of organic material from a shipwreck site if it's buried. Like on the Bell, there were skeletal remains that actually had brain matter that survived. And so that's one thing that's kind of unique about underwater sites versus land sites, is you can have really good organic preservation, and also because of the deeper water depths, you can get intact artifacts and less disturbance, right? That kind of thing.
Thank you so much. Renee has another question. He says, are other countries interested in acquiring material culture from these shipwrecks? I know Texas has unique maritime laws, but are there ways the state works with other historians, archaeologists, or nations? And then it has a follow-up question. Do artifacts get repatriated?
So because of the Abandoned Shipwreck Act, the artifacts that are in state lands are kind of managed by the states as they see fit. And that's why shipwreck preservation laws vary from state to state. And so if it's an abandoned shipwreck that doesn't have, that especially doesn't have, that's not a government owned, but actually I'll tell you what, Texas does not own US military vessels. That's under the purview of the Naval History and Heritage Command. And we don't own international government vessels or military vessels, so there's, limitations. But as far as our held and trust collections, like I know that we do loan, like the main repository for the material culture from shipwreck sites is actually at the Corpus Christi Museum of Science and History in Corpus Christi. And those artifacts, the shipwreck artifacts, do get loaned out. Like La Belle, for example, in 1554, those do get loaned out to museums around the state. And I know that we were working with France at one point in time, and actually the La Belle material culture is theirs. It's French artifacts, and we were working with them to help them secure loans for material culture for a planned exhibit for them that never came to fruition. That's a great question. I don't know of us loaning artifacts out per se outside of the country, but we do work regularly with archaeologists and historians and specialists around the United States to do artifact analysis, or artifact research. Like that's kind of a complex question because you're getting into ownership. And again, I'm not the collections manager for the Texas Historical Commission, but we love working with partners with our collections, especially to help learn from them. And there's actually another shipwreck that I recently learned about that is, I want to say it's off of the French Brittany, and it dates to 1817, and it's an English supply ship for Bolivar. And so that would be a great ship for me to coordinate on, because again, these 1817 ships that I'm looking at are potentially have material culture that might be similar. So how I'm looking forward to trying to coordinate with others so that I can learn more about our archaeology. I'm hoping that others reach out to us as well. That probably was a really long answer. Sorry.
No, it's good. It's a good question, and it's a great answer because it helps illustrate how interconnected we are across the historic preservation sphere, and how, you know, it takes many hands to make light work, and we have many friends that we work with and partner with to make things happen. So
I mean, like, well, one of the when I was first looking at the Pascagoula wreck, I wasn't looking at the 1817 candidate as seriously back then, because a lot of the evidence I found supported sort of the British sale of their surplus as being almost at that time or a little later. So I didn't know if we really had that many British arms like before that, before 1817, and that early date of the 20,000 arms from 1808, 1809, that actually came from a Mexican arms specialist who read my thesis and contacted me to let me know that there was a reference for that. And so that's, like, again, I love it when and again, like, I reach out to reenactors, I reach out to firearm forums, to it's anyone that I can learn from. I don't pretend to be the expert in all this. I mean, a lot of this I've just had to sort of learn through experience. And so any help that I can get or any help I can provide someone else is great.
yeah, that's amazing. Alan has a question about what is the shipwreck that a DAR group in Houston is hoping to fund?
Oh, no, I don't know if I know about the DAR, but the Texas Navy Association has been trying to find Invincible. Like, that's the one that might be, maybe that's what you're thinking of. I'm not familiar.
Alan, you can unmute yourself and ask your question if you want to, if you're still here. Okay, maybe not.
Yeah, I'm wondering if he's thinking of the Invincible, because Invincible is a Texas Navy ship, and archaeologists have been looking for that for years. There were some earlier surveys
I'm
that
here.
that did discover it.
Oh, hi. Okay, go
I'm
ahead.
here. It's actually Patty. I'm using Alan's computer.
Oh,
Okay.
Yeah, I have a friend who's a DAR member in Houston, and she was talking about a shipwreck off the coast of Galveston that they were funding to try to help, I guess, figure out who it belonged to and, more about it. I just texted her. I wondered what the name of the ship was, but she didn't get back to me. So I just wondered if you knew about that.
I don't know about that. I mean, is it one
Okay.
that's been discovered already, or is it one that's being looked for?
The one that's already been discovered, and they were going, I think, to help fund some of the
Houston area.
Yeah, it would be it would be in Galveston, somewhere off the coast of Galveston. So that was why I was interested in what you were saying about a couple of the, ships that have been
Galveston, because we have the shipwreck that maybe is at Zavala. I mean, we have quite a few Civil War shipwrecks in that general area. But yeah, let me know if you find out, because that would be really.
I will.
interesting.
This would, of course, because it's DAR, it would be, Revolutionary. It would be
Right.
something before that, I believe. So yeah, I just didn't remember what the ship's name was. She was telling me about it. I was fascinated about it.
I mean, because I know there's one that people have been looking for years off of Virginia Point, I think, called the Thomas Toby, I think the Thomas Toby, but to my knowledge, it hasn't been discovered yet. So if you find out what that is, I mean, again, I can't say that my Rolodex instant recall is perfect. But yeah, please let me know.
And just
I will.
for folks,
Thank you so much. This is wonderful. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. And just for folks who aren't familiar with what DAR stands for, we have a question about that. Can you tell us what that stands for? Is it Daughters of the American?
It's the Daughters of the American Revolution, and she belongs to a group in Houston, and I live out in Brenham, so I haven't joined the group out here yet. But I'm a member. I'm a member in Mississippi, actually. So
okay, good. Thank you. That answers a question for someone in our chat. So thank you so much. Okay, so moving on, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. I know it is getting a little bit late, but I think we can get these last few. Mark is asking, what is the next exciting project in the near future?
And actually, I almost advertised that because, my favorite privateer, Ari, and part of the reason I like Ari so much is because no one really knows, he's not really remembered very well in Texas history. And part of that is because he was not at Galveston very long. before Lafitte sort of took his encampment away from him. Like he was off with his fleet, dropping off some filibusters for some, like one group was going to La Bahia, the other group was going to Soto La Maria. And so he dropped these groups off. Both were defeated actually. And then he was investigating a second encampment, a second and privateer encampment. And when he got back from that, he realized that Lafitte had sort of taken over his encampment at Galveston while in his absence. And so when he ended up kind of relocating to Matagorda Bay. And so the project that we have going on was he lost a ship entering the bay, he lost a ship exiting the bay, but he also, and I have some historians that I'm working with. We have like a little team that we're kind of putting this project together, but it looks like he lost 9 ships at his privateer camp there. And there's different accounts. Some think that they were destroyed by him. Some think they were destroyed by the Spanish. Some think they were destroyed by another privateer, like potentially Lafitte. And so we're wanting to look for those shipwrecks because, you know, I mentioned earlier that kind of the problem with this archaeology is we just don't really have a good baseline because we have so few wrecks. And like for example, with Monterey Shipwreck A, you know, we know that it has to date by at least 1816. So for me, that's exciting because if that ends up being a privateer, then that means it's a privateer that's attached to the revolutions in Latin America and Mexico and not the War of 1812. And I would really love for us to find some maritime archaeology for that really significant period. And if we can, you know, if we are looking for RE ships and we're able to find 9 ships that are burned, you know, they're in this particular, you know, in the kind of the area we're looking, there's nothing else they could be, you know. So while with Pascavallo or with the Mardi Gras wreck or Monterey, you can kind of go, well, you know, is it a privateer? Is it not? Is it a, you know, like what is it? Is it a gun runner? You know, if we found these RE shipwrecks, this cluster of shipwrecks, that would be really kind of irrefutable evidence and, you know, irrefutable archaeology for that period. That's dateable, you know, and could be used to help expand our research and our knowledge of this time. So we're, you know, we're trying to get out earlier. COVID kind of put a 2-year hiatus on us getting out, but we're like, now we're this late in the year. I don't know if we'll get out this year, but we're hoping to run a survey, a remote sensing survey, but maybe later this year or early next year to see if we can find some of these missing ships.
Exciting. I love it. So that looked to me like the last question in the chat. Is there anyone that wants to unmute themselves and ask a question before we close tonight?
Yes. Hello. How you doing?
Hi.
Yes. Thank you for the presentation. You had mentioned the USS Zavala, and I
Yes.
wanted to know if there was additional information you can talk about that, because I'm actually with an organization who's named after the USS Zavala. So I wanted to get more history about that. If you give a little more background or at least a link to where I can go research it more.
Yeah, I mean, like, well, first of all, send me your email. The Texas Republic era Zavala was actually a merchant vessel named Charleston that was purchased and converted. And it's an extremely significant vessel because it was the first steam propelled warship in North America. So it was a steamer and the only steamship of the Texas Navy. And but unfortunately, like if any of y'all know Texas history, there was a kind of a huge conflict between Sam Houston and the Commodore of the fleet, Edwin Moore. And Sam Houston sort of, I don't know, I'm trying to say it politely, but he just wasn't really encouraged to help preserve the Navy and make sure that it was taken care of. And so some of the ships of the later Texas Navy, even though Zavala was a merchant ship that was converted, but the other vessels, Austin and San Jacinto and San Bernard and the other vessels, those were brand new, built for Texas, and a lot of those they fell under disrepair and were rotting. Yeah. So Zavala was like driven ashore to keep it from sinking. So yeah, it's just there was a real struggle between Sam Houston and his Navy. He wasn't really proactive. He wasn't really a supporter of the Texas Navy. But yeah, just send me I don't know if there's like the THC worked with NUMA, the same group that found the Pascagoula wreck, led that project to find Zavala on the Port of Galveston property. And then there's more work that's been done recently. So I don't know if a lot of that's published or published in a public format, but we certainly do have a lot of research on it at work. Like, and one thing I'll recommend to any of y'all who are Texas Navy fans, the Texas State Library and Archives has a collection of Texas Navy papers, and I conducted research on Zavala, and Zavala was actually, you know, I told you that it had been sort of sunk to keep it from running. It was running around to keep it from sinking. They actually took it apart and sold it at auction, and that catalog and that inventory of its piece parts is actually at the Texas Navy, or the Texas Navy papers at the state archives, and it's pretty cool. Like they were selling it in lots and pounds of timber and copper and iron, and you know, it's, to me, it's one of the neatest documents I've ever read, because it's really the death of a Navy ship and a death of a Navy. You know, the Republic of Texas was a 9-year Navy, so it's really neat when you go through the Texas Navy papers, because you can really see its beginning and end, you know, just in this real finite period. So yeah, lots of cool stuff at the Texas State Library and Archives on the Texas Navy. And there's also Texas State Library and Archives also hosts an online portal, the Republic of Texas Claims Records. And a lot of people use that for genealogy. But if you type in ship names or ships, you can type in schooner or sloop, and it will bring you up documentation on watercraft as well. That's one of my favorite sort of secret resources for doing shipwreck research, is the Republic of Texas Claims Records.
And one last question: what class was the USS Zavala? Class of ship.
I don't actually know of the class of ship. Like I said, the Texas Navy was a little bit different, and I don't know if it followed some of the same categorizing structure as the U.S. Navy. It was just I want to say that it was a side wheel steamer with a walking beam engine, but I'm not. Yeah, I mean, anything else more detailed, I can probably find and get to you.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Okay, any last questions? All right, well, I am so grateful to you, Amy, for joining us, and for all of you who joined us for this in the audience for this today and asked questions. And we're so glad that you stopped by. And if you have any follow-up questions, I will put my email address in the chat and you can reach out to me. There's also staff here at THC who can answer questions. You can visit our website, Friends of THC, or Texas Historical Commission's website to find out more information. And Amy, is there a website particular to maritime that I can share in the chat, or that you can?
Yeah, I mean, we do have, I need to update it, but we do have a marine archaeology program page.
Okay.
Let me see if I can, and for the work that we've done, I need to be a little bit more, I need to be better at updating the work that we're doing on that page.
Well, it sounds like you're slightly busy, so we'll give you a break.
There's one of me.
Exactly.
You know, I love the potential for archaeology in Texas and the Gulf of Mexico. I think it's fascinating. I'm a big fan.
It truly is. It truly is. And I loved the questions that people were asking. They're some of the questions that I've wondered too. So I think we had a great audience tonight, and definitely appreciate your time. Okay, so I'm going to try to find that maritime page and I'll put it in the chat. But I think other than that, I think we're done.
Yeah, if I find it first, I'll plop it in there.
Okay.
It's Marine Archaeology Program. The Texas Historical Commission is what you would Google.
I should have had that ready to drop in the chat. I was not on the game.
Yeah, I found it.
Okay, great.
Tag it in there. Okay, if I can.
And you're getting so many compliments in the chat. So
that went to direct message. Hold on, let me do everyone. Sorry.
That's okay. There we go. There's the website where you can find out more. So hopefully you can copy and paste that into your browser, keep that for later. And we hope you will join us next time for our September presentation about deconstructing tamales. It's going to be a good one. Don't miss it. And keep up with us on our website and on social media for future virtual events that we will be hosting. And we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.